villagers of Borley whispered that something sinister lingered at the edge of Essex's quiet countryside, a place where shadows seemed to move even when the wind lay still. They called it the Rectory, an ordinary building by appearance, but a house so cursed that even the bravest avoided walking past its gates after dark. Built in 1862, it should have been nothing more than a clergy's residence. Yet, from the moment its foundation touched the earth, stories began, stories of apparitions, whispers in empty rooms, and a phantom nun who wandered the garden as if condemned to relive some ancient sorrow. It was a June evening in 1900 when the first recorded account set the legend into motion. The daughters of the Reverend Henry Bull, the first rector to live there, were playing outside when they froze in terror. At the edge of the property stood a woman in black, her face pale, her steps deliberate. She glided silently across the gravel, heading toward the garden wall. The girls thought she was lost, perhaps a passerby, but then, before their eyes, the figure dissolved into nothing. From that day, the nun became an enduring presence, reported by multiple witnesses over decades, her appearance tied to unease and the feeling of being watched. Word spread quickly, and whispers became warnings. The Bull family grew accustomed to strange occurrences, footsteps echoing in deserted halls, bells ringing in the dead of night, and knocks on doors that opened to empty corridors. Reverend Bull himself dismissed the tales at first, calling them superstitions. Yet even he began avoiding certain rooms after dusk. He built a summer house overlooking the spot where the phantom nun appeared, almost as though he wished to study her, or challenge her. Locals said he grew increasingly obsessed, staring out across the grounds, waiting. The rectory's reputation grew darker when Reverend Bull died within its walls in 1892. His son, Reverend Henry Harry Bull, inherited both the position and the house. If anything, the disturbances intensified. Parishioners began avoiding visits, and even staff servants rarely lasted long. They spoke of windows shattering by themselves, strange whispers that seemed to follow them through the hallways, and the sound of rushing silk skirts brushing past their legs when no one was there. The house seemed to breathe with its own restless life. By the time the 1920s arrived, Borley Rectory was infamous. Locals told tales of headless horsemen racing through the lanes nearby, of unseen hands tugging at clothing, of lights appearing in windows long after the house was empty. But the most chilling accounts still centered on the nun. Witnesses described her silently traversing the gardens, her expression a mask of grief. Some said she was the spirit of a woman who had broken holy vows, buried alive as punishment centuries earlier, her soul condemned to wander. Others believed she had been murdered and hidden beneath the soil, her body never recovered. Whatever the truth, her presence carried an unshakable weight of sorrow. The rectory's notoriety reached its peak in 1929 when the Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife moved in. Hoping for a fresh start in their ministry, they instead found themselves in the grip of relentless disturbances. Mrs. Smith discovered a human skull wrapped in brown paper in the cupboard of one room. Objects moved without explanation, mirrors shattered as if struck by invisible hands, and at night, they were kept awake by the sound of whispers, footsteps, and the ringing of servant bells long disconnected from service. Terrified, Mrs. Smith wrote to a newspaper, begging for help. The story captured national attention, and soon the Society for Psychical Research dispatched their most famous investigator, Harry Price. Charismatic, theatrical, and controversial, Price was both believer and showman. He arrived with a team of reporters and assistants, setting up in the rectory with notebooks, cameras, and equipment meant to capture the unseen. What they encountered only deepened the mystery. Strange writing appeared on the walls, often pleading messages like, "Marianne, please help me," directed at Marianne Foister, the wife of the next rector to live there. Objects were hurled across rooms with no visible source. Cold spots lingered in the air. Price declared Borley Rectory the most haunted house in England, and the press sensationalized his findings. Crowds gathered outside the gates, eager for a glimpse of the phantom nun. Some saw her. Many claimed to hear knocks echoing across the grounds. Others swore they felt a hand on their shoulder, only to turn and find no one there. By the 1930s, the rectory had become a stage where the living and the dead performed a grim play for all who dared enter. The activity grew violent, especially during the time of Reverend Lionel Foister and his wife Marianne. Doors slammed with such force the wood splintered. Marianne reported being thrown from her bed by unseen hands. The walls bore more scrawled messages, begging for prayers, for release, for an end to the torment. The Foisters fled, unable to endure the constant terror. What was once a place of faith had transformed into something far darker, a house where no one could live in peace, where the boundary between the living and the dead was shredded beyond recognition. By 1939, the house itself seemed to share its occupants' fate. It caught fire under mysterious circumstances, burning to a ruin. But witnesses said the ghostly nun and other apparitions remained, wandering among the charred walls, unwilling or unable to leave. Borley Rectory did not just become a story. It became a legend. A place where history, tragedy, and the supernatural entwined so tightly that truth and myth were inseparable. And as investigators debated, as skeptics argued, as villagers warned, one thing remained certain: those who stood before its ruins at night swore they were not alone. The ruins of Borley Rectory still smoldered in memory when Harry Price returned to the site in 1937, determined to uncover the truth that had eluded so many. By then, the house was empty, its reputation sealed as something more than mere bricks and timber. It was a nexus where fear, faith, and the supernatural collided. Price, never one to let a haunting slip through his fingers, secured a year-long lease. He brought with him not only equipment but a team of eager volunteers, students, and assistants who would help document every chilling detail of life inside the broken shell of England's most haunted house. For those who stayed with him, the nights were rarely quiet. Reports filled notebooks with unnerving consistency, faint music drifting through corridors that no longer had windows, a woman's sobbing echoing between walls that were now half collapsed, and sudden icy drafts chilling rooms even when fires roared in the hearth. Skeptics mocked Price for sensationalizing, yet his evidence grew overwhelming. Shadows darted across doorways, phantom footsteps marched across empty rooms, and most disturbing of all, writing continued to appear on the walls as though some unseen hand still begged for help. The most famous of these writings came in the form of childlike scrawls addressed directly to Marianne Foister, even though she no longer lived there. Phrases such as "Marianne, please help me" and "light mass" prayers were found smeared across plaster. Some researchers believed these were fraudulent, created by overzealous members of Price's team. But others swore they saw the words form slowly, one letter at a time, in real time, as if guided by invisible chalk. Price's team organized nightly vigils, sitting in near darkness for hours, watching, waiting. One of his volunteers described seeing a brick rise from the ground and hover in midair before being hurled across a room. Another recalled watching a candlestick spin violently on a table as though caught in a whirlwind. Every creak of the house, every moan of the wind, became part of the symphony of dread that defined Borley Rectory. But the most chilling moment came when the nun appeared again. Several witnesses, including a local villager who had long feared the property, claimed to see her drifting along the garden path. She moved silently, her form pale, her eyes cast downward. Price noted her appearance with great care, the long habit, the mournful face, and the way she dissolved into the night air as if swallowed by it. To the believers, this was no trick of the light. This was the house's restless soul, still chained to its grounds. Curiously, Borley's disturbances were never confined to visual phenomena. Sounds haunted the ruins in ways that defied natural explanation. The investigators heard servant bells ring from rooms where the wires had long since been severed. Heavy footsteps thundered up the staircase even when no one stood near. Doors slammed with such violence that nails cracked from their hinges. And always, the whispers, the soft, indistinct voices that lingered at the edges of hearing, close enough to unsettle but never clear enough to understand. Price himself began to weave together theories. He suspected the land itself carried a history of violence, older than the rectory. Local legend spoke of a Benedictine monastery once standing nearby, where, according to rumor, a young nun had broken her vows of chastity by falling in love with a monk. They planned to elope, but their affair was discovered. The monk was executed, and the nun, if the tale is true, was buried alive within the convent walls as punishment. The spectral nun of Borley, Price believed, was her restless ghost, bound forever by the injustice of her fate. Not everyone agreed with Price's conclusions. Critics accused him of exaggeration, of staging phenomena to secure his reputation. Yet even his fiercest detractors admitted one unsettling fact: too many independent witnesses, from servants to vicars to strangers passing by, reported the same figures, the same voices, the same inexplicable activity. To dismiss all of it as fraud seemed almost impossible. As months passed, Price's team collected hundreds of documented experiences. They experimented with seances, attempting to contact whatever spirit lingered there. During one such session, a voice allegedly spoke through the medium, identifying itself as the murdered nun and pleading for release. It warned that the rectory would soon be destroyed by fire, claiming that human remains buried beneath the house would then be revealed. Skeptical as always, Price recorded the prophecy. When, in 1939, Borley Rectory did indeed burn under mysterious circumstances, the prediction gained new weight. The fire started when the new owner, Captain W. H. Gregson, accidentally knocked over an oil lamp. The flames consumed the already decaying structure, leaving behind only skeletal ruins. Yet even in destruction, the house refused to rest. Villagers claimed to see phantom figures moving through the smoke, and more than one eyewitness swore that the nun could still be seen wandering the rubble, untouched by flame. In the aftermath of the fire, Harry Price returned once more. He led excavations at the site, searching for the promised remains. In 1943, his team unearthed fragments of a human skull, believed by some to be the bones of the tormented nun. Price arranged for a Christian burial in hopes of granting peace. But whether the burial released her or whether she still roamed the grounds remained a matter of belief. By then, Borley Rectory had transcended its physical form. It was no longer simply a house, it was legend. Its reputation spread across newspapers, books, and radio broadcasts, capturing the imagination of thousands. For some, it stood as undeniable proof of life after death. For others, it was the greatest hoax in paranormal history. But for those who had walked its halls, heard its whispers, or glimpsed its pale inhabitants, there was no question: Borley Rectory was cursed ground, a place where the dead still lingered. By the time the Foister family moved into Borley Rectory in 1930, the house's reputation was already poisoned. Villagers shook their heads, warning Lionel and Marianne Foister that they were stepping into more than just a vicarage, they were inheriting a curse. Lionel, scholarly and calm, dismissed such talk as superstition. Marianne, however, felt an unease the moment she crossed the threshold. The air inside seemed too heavy, as though the walls themselves were listening. Their first nights were punctuated by noises, faint knocks at the doors, footsteps pacing above their bedroom. Lionel insisted it was the house settling, rats in the walls, or pranksters testing their nerves. But Marianne couldn't shake the feeling that something watched her every move. Then came the first of the writings. One morning, Marianne entered the dining room to find words scrawled across the wall in large, clumsy letters. "Marianne, please help me." Her blood turned cold. She wiped the message away, convinced it was a cruel joke. Yet days later, another appeared. Sometimes the writing was smeared, as if drawn with dirt or soot, other times faint like chalk dust. The messages became more insistent. "Pray for me. Light mass. I cannot rest." Lionel examined the walls, looking for trick mechanisms or chemicals that might cause markings to appear. He found nothing. The disturbances escalated with alarming speed. Objects flew across rooms, hurled by invisible hands. Crucifixes were torn from the walls and smashed to the ground. Marianne reported being slapped, scratched, even thrown from her bed at night. Servants who came to assist the family rarely lasted more than a week, fleeing in terror after being chased by footsteps, hearing disembodied voices call their names, or finding their belongings hurled down staircases. One evening, as Lionel read aloud from scripture in an attempt to bless the home, the dining room door swung open with such violence that it cracked against the wall. Books tumbled from shelves, and the chandelier shook violently overhead. Marianne screamed as she felt unseen hands grip her wrists, cold and unyielding, holding her in place. Lionel rushed to her, only for the force to release suddenly, leaving dark red marks on her skin. Despite their faith, the Foysters could not ignore the reality of their situation. Lionel recorded over 2,000 incidents during their short time in the rectory, meticulously noting the dates and times. His journals, later studied by investigators, painted a picture of unrelenting terror. He described phantom writing that appeared while he watched, doors that locked themselves, and ghostly apparitions of monks, soldiers, and pale faces staring through windows at impossible angles. But the most persistent entity remained the nun. Marianne saw her several times, gliding past the windows or drifting across the gardens. Sometimes the nun appeared in moments of silence, almost mournful. Other times, her presence was heralded by chaos, loud knocks, cold winds, and the smell of burning candles. Marianne grew convinced that the nun was trying to communicate, to deliver a message that could not be ignored. Rumors began to spread that Marianne herself was somehow the cause of the disturbances. Some believed the spirits were drawn to her, that she was a focus for the energy that plagued the house. Others accused her of fabricating the phenomena, though the sheer scale of the activity made that claim difficult to sustain. Marianne herself admitted that she felt a strange connection to the house, as though its tormented souls had singled her out. The breaking point came when Lionel fell ill, his health deteriorating rapidly under the stress. Marianne begged him to leave, but his sense of duty kept him tethered to the rectory longer than was safe. It was only after repeated violent attacks and his worsening condition that the couple finally fled in 1935, abandoning the house to its ghosts. Their departure left Borley Rectory silent for a time, but silence at Borley was never truly peace. Neighbors still reported seeing flickering lights in the empty windows, hearing the tolling of bells from within the deserted building. On certain nights, the nun was seen again, drifting through the ruins as though nothing had changed. When word of the Foyster ordeal reached Harry Price, he seized the opportunity. He saw in Borley not only a case of spiritual torment but also a stage to cement his name in the annals of paranormal history. To him, the Foyster's suffering was undeniable proof that Borley Rectory was no ordinary haunting. It was, as he proclaimed to the press, the most haunted house in England. Price's arrival would mark the beginning of the rectory's most famous chapter. Cameras, notebooks, and seances would transform the house into a laboratory of the unexplained. But beneath all the investigation, all the speculation, the same chilling reality persisted. Those who lived at Borley paid a price in fear, and those who left carried its shadow forever. When Harry Price finally took possession of Borley Rectory in 1937, he approached it less like a clergyman's home and more like a laboratory for the supernatural. By this time, the Foysters had abandoned the house, their ordeal well documented, and the press had already christened Borley the most haunted house in England. Price was determined to prove it beyond doubt. He leased the rectory for an entire year, not to live in it comfortably but to study it like a specimen. To accomplish this, he assembled a team of nearly 50 volunteers, students, scientists, journalists, and members of the Society for Psychical Research. Each participant signed up for vigils, spending long, sleepless nights inside the house's creaking corridors, armed with notebooks, flashlights, and a nervous determination. The protocols were meticulous. Price divided the rectory into zones, assigning observers to record any unusual activity with the precision of a scientific experiment. They logged times, weather conditions, and exact locations. The result was a staggering catalog of paranormal events, bells ringing where no wires connected, the sound of footsteps circling rooms in which no one stood, sudden cold spots that chilled breath to mist, and objects that moved of their own volition. One volunteer reported watching a small vase slowly slide across a table before tipping over. Another swore she saw a shadowy figure glide past her in the corridor, only to vanish when she gave chase. Several documented the sounds of whispers so faint that they seemed to brush directly against the ear, impossible to locate. The rectory, even stripped of normal family life, refused to rest. But the most disturbing aspect remained the writings. Long after the Foysters had gone, new messages continued to appear on the walls in scraps of paper. Light Mass, prayers was scribbled in crude letters. Marianne, please help me surfaced again, despite Marianne being nowhere near the property. This consistency unsettled the researchers. Was a single entity desperate to be heard? Or had the house itself become a vessel for anguish, replaying its messages like an echo carved into stone? Price himself described nights when the atmosphere turned oppressive, so heavy that even breathing felt like inhaling smoke. On one occasion, he sat in the library when a crucifix dropped from the wall without warning, landing inches from his head. Another time, a brick, left from renovations, rose from the rubble and shot across the room with force, embedding itself into plaster. Skeptics might have accused Price of theatrics, but dozens of witnesses claimed similar events during his vigils. The most famous apparition appeared one winter evening when several volunteers stood outside in the garden. They watched as a pale figure glided along the familiar path near the wall where generations had seen the phantom nun. The team described her as tall, draped in flowing black, with her head bowed as though in eternal sorrow. When Price attempted to photograph her, the figure dissolved into mist before the camera could click. To those present, it was confirmation the nun was no mere folktale. Price also conducted seances within the rectory, seeking direct communication. In one session, a medium claimed to channel a spirit who identified herself as the murdered nun of legend, punished centuries earlier for breaking her vows. She begged for prayers and release. More chillingly, another voice came through during a different seance, warning that the house itself was doomed. It prophesied that the rectory would soon burn and that the remains of a victim, buried beneath, would be revealed in the flames. Price, skeptical but intrigued, recorded the prediction carefully in his notes. His investigation drew enormous public attention. Newspapers published his updates, and the British public was both enthralled and horrified. Some accused him of exploiting the story for fame, others saw him as a pioneer finally peeling back the veil between worlds. Regardless of opinion, Borley Rectory became more than a house. It became a cultural phenomenon, the stage on which believers and skeptics battled for dominance. Yet even amidst the sensationalism, those who stayed at Borley during Price's lease confessed to an unnerving truth: the house seemed to feed on attention. The more people studied it, the more active it became. The walls groaned with unexplained knocks, windows shattered in bursts of violence, and the shadows grew bolder. It was as though the rectory thrived on fear itself. In 1939, just as the ominous seance had predicted, the house met its fiery end. The new owner, Captain W. H. Gregson, accidentally overturned an oil lamp, sparking a blaze that devoured the already decaying structure. Villagers rushed to the scene, watching as flames consumed the legendary walls. Some swore they saw ghostly figures dancing in the firelight. Others claimed to see the nun herself, standing motionless amid the smoke until the roof collapsed. Though the building was gone, Borley's story was far from finished. The land still bore the weight of centuries, and the ruins remained haunted. Visitors continued to report strange lights flickering in the rubble, phantom voices calling from the charred earth, and the lingering sense of sorrow that had plagued the rectory from the very beginning. For Harry Price, Borley Rectory became his life's crowning achievement, a haunting so complex, so relentless, that it defied dismissal. Yet, for the families who had lived there, it was not an achievement but a scar. They had endured something no newspaper could truly capture, a home where prayers could not protect, where walls could not shield, and where the dead demanded to be remembered. When the fire of 1939 reduced Borley Rectory to a blackened skeleton, many believed its legend would fade with the smoke. Yet, if anything, the destruction only deepened the mystery. The gutted ruins became a pilgrimage site for the curious and the fearful alike. Villagers warned outsiders not to tread too close, but still they came, climbers, journalists, and thrill seekers, each hoping to glimpse something unexplainable among the charred stones. Harry Price returned with renewed determination. The fire, he insisted, was not the end but the beginning of a final revelation. If the spirits had foretold the blaze, then their prophecy must hold more truths. In 1943, he launched an excavation of the ruins, supported by a team of assistants who dug through ash and debris, recording every fragment unearthed. What they found sent shivers through even the most skeptical volunteers. Among the rubble lay fragments of a human skull, scorched but unmistakably real. Price declared the discovery proof that the haunting was tied to a real tragedy, perhaps the remains of the nun whose sorrow had saturated the house for centuries. Though forensic analysis of the era was limited, the skull was examined by experts who concluded it was female. Price arranged for Christian burial, hoping that consecrated ground might grant the spirit peace. On the day of the ceremony, villagers gathered in silence. Some whispered prayers, others crossed themselves nervously. Yet when the coffin was lowered into the earth, witnesses claimed the atmosphere grew colder, not warmer. One woman later swore she saw the nun standing among the mourners, her face hidden beneath her veil, fading only as the final shovelfuls of dirt struck the coffin. If the burial was meant to end the haunting, it seemed instead to cement the nun's eternal presence. Still, not everyone accepted Price's findings. The Society for Psychical Research launched a scathing critique, accusing him of embellishment and fraud. They argued that many of his volunteers were untrained and impressionable, that the writings could have been forged, and that the skull may have been planted. To them, Borley was not the most haunted house in England but the most cleverly exploited. Yet dismissing Borley was not so simple. Too many independent witnesses, vicars, parishioners, police officers, and ordinary villagers had documented experiences long before Price ever stepped foot inside. A laborer recalled hearing church bells ring from the rectory after midnight, though the bell wires had been cut years earlier. A neighbor claimed to see a horse-drawn coach, spectral and silent, rattling past the gates before dissolving into fog. Mary Ann Foyster herself, long after leaving, maintained that the attacks she suffered were real, her bruises and terror undeniable. The debate over Price's honesty became as much a part of Borley's story as the hauntings themselves. To believers, the ruins were sacred proof of the afterlife, a place where history's sins cried out for recognition. To skeptics, it was a stage, and Price its clever conductor, orchestrating phenomena to secure fame. But even skeptics struggled to explain why so many unrelated people described the same pale nun, the same chilling footsteps, the same relentless knocks. As the 1940s pressed on, Borley's ruins decayed further, but the activity did not stop. Locals spoke of glowing lights appearing among the charred timbers at night. Travelers reported hearing voices whispering in Latin from the rubble. A farmer swore he saw shadowy figures pacing near the collapsed walls, their outlines sharp against the moonlight, only to vanish when he approached. For some, the house's destruction only amplified the spirit's unrest. Without walls to contain them, the entities seemed freer, more dispersed across the land. One man described walking past the ruins and suddenly feeling as though dozens of unseen figures surrounded him, their presence so tangible he broke into a sprint without looking back. Another, more skeptical, ventured into the site one evening and laughed at the legends, until he felt an icy hand clamp down on his shoulder, sending him staggering into the grass. By the time of Harry Price's death in 1948, Borley Rectory had become an enduring paradox. It was both shrine and scandal, both proof and hoax, both warning and curiosity. His books on the rectory sold widely, feeding imaginations around the world. Newspapers still printed stories of the phantom nun and the cursed ruins. Paranormal investigators continued to visit, some claiming experiences as vivid as any Price had recorded. What Price left behind was not just documentation but a cultural wound that refused to heal. To this day, arguments rage over whether he exposed the supernatural or engineered it. Yet one fact remains: Borley Rectory was not forgotten. Its legend endured, whispered in pubs, printed in ghost anthologies, and shared in hushed voices among those who dared visit its grounds at night. In the ashes of the fire, the rectory became more than a house, it became a symbol. A place where faith, tragedy, and fear collided, where the line between truth and myth blurred until neither could be separated. And those who stood among the ruins long after the flames had cooled swore the air still carried the same heavy weight, the same watchful silence, as though the dead were not done with Borley. After Harry Price's death in 1948, the story of Borley Rectory did not rest with him. Instead, the controversy ignited with new life. Skeptics, journalists, and members of the Society for Psychical Research tore through Price's notes, interviews, and photographs, determined to separate truth from embellishment. To them, Borley was not only a haunted house but a battleground for credibility, where faith and doubt clashed as fiercely as any poltergeist's rage. Critics quickly seized on inconsistencies. They argued that many of Price's volunteers lacked proper training, that his seances relied too heavily on suggestible mediums, and that some of the wall writings bore signs of human interference. A damning report published in 1956 accused Price of exaggerating and, at times, outright staging phenomena. To these investigators, Borley was not supernatural, it was theater, and Price had been its director. But the haunting refused to die under the weight of criticism. Even as academics tried to dismantle the legend, villagers continued to whisper of unexplained events at the ruins. Fishermen claimed to see a woman in black drifting near the old garden wall, her figure illuminated by moonlight before vanishing into thin air. A mail carrier delivering letters along the country lane reported hearing bells tolling from the rubble, though no such bells remained. For every skeptic shouting fraud, another witness emerged with a story too chilling to ignore. Local farmers were among the most adamant. One described leading his horse past the ruins on a summer evening when the animal froze, trembling violently. The farmer looked up and saw a shadowy form moving through the rubble, its outline unmistakably human yet unnaturally tall. Before he could react, the figure dissolved into the night air, leaving the horse sweating and wild-eyed. He never walked that route again. There were others who dared to explore the ruins directly. Teenagers from neighboring villages sneaked onto the grounds, daring one another to spend a night within the cracked walls. Some returned shaken, swearing they heard footsteps circling them in the dark. Others ran screaming after seeing pale faces staring from what had once been windows, even though the glass had long since shattered. One boy, interviewed decades later, admitted that the experience haunted him for life. He felt, he said, as though the house itself wanted us gone, like we had trespassed on something sacred and furious. For believers, these accounts only confirmed what Price had always claimed: Borley was different. It was not a hoax spun by one man, but a place drenched in sorrow, where the dead remained tethered to the living. To skeptics, the persistence of stories was proof not of spirits but of folklore's power. They argued that Borley had become a psychological trap. People went expecting fear, and fear shaped what they saw and heard. Still, there were reports too specific, too consistent to dismiss so easily. The nun, always the nun, her face downcast, her steps measured, her sorrow unending. She appeared across decades, to priests, children, investigators, and strangers alike. Witnesses who had never spoken to one another described her in the same mournful terms. Even if one could disprove the flying objects, the phantom writings, the shattered glass, how could so many unrelated people imagine the same figure? The media, ever hungry for drama, leaned into the mystery. Magazines ran sensational features, framing Borley as either the ultimate haunting or the ultimate fraud. The public devoured every article, unable to look away from the paradox. For many, it didn't matter whether Borley was real or staged, it mattered that it was terrifying. And in the realm of folklore, terror is truth enough. By the 1960s, the ruins had been largely cleared, stones carted away, weeds swallowing the last foundations. Yet even without walls, the legend endured. Psychics visited the site, claiming to feel waves of despair radiating from the soil itself. Ghost hunters carried tape recorders, capturing faint whispers and inexplicable knocks on audio. Some claimed to photograph orbs of light hovering among the trees. To the uninitiated, the land appeared barren. To the initiated, it was alive with voices that refused to be silenced. The debate over Borley became less about proof and more about belief. Those who stood among the ruins with open skepticism often left unmoved, dismissing strange sounds as wildlife, the cold as natural drafts. But those who came with reverence, or fear, or even curiosity, often left with stories of their own. Stories that mirrored those written in Lionel Foyster's journals, that echoed Harry Price's reports, that aligned with a century of whispers. And so Borley lingered, not just in Essex soil, but in the imagination of all who heard its name. The most haunted house in England was gone, yet somehow more present than ever. Its ghost stories outlived its walls, retold in books, lectures, and documentaries. Whether fraud or fact, one thing was undeniable: Borley Rectory had secured its place as a haunting that refused to die. By the 1970s, Borley Rectory no longer existed as a standing building, and its legend seemed only to grow stronger in absence. The land itself became a magnet for curiosity seekers, researchers, and thrill hunters, drawn not by walls of brick but by the heavy aura that still hung over the site. It was said that if you stood there in silence long enough, you would hear it: the faint tolling of bells, the soft cry of a woman, the echo of footsteps where no floors remained. Paranormal investigators from across Britain began making pilgrimages. Armed with cameras, tape recorders, and later electromagnetic devices, they combed the ruins and surrounding fields. Though the skeptics scoffed at their methods, the teams reported consistent phenomena. Faint voices captured on magnetic tape seemed to whisper in Latin. Sudden cold spots engulfed researchers even on warm nights. Some claimed to see flashes of light, as though candles burned briefly in the dark before being extinguished. One team from a university society recorded what they believed to be a female voice repeating the same word: mercy. Though distorted, the recording unnerved even those in the group who had been reluctant to believe. Another visitor, a writer documenting the site, described walking the perimeter when he felt an overwhelming sorrow, so intense he collapsed to his knees, unable to breathe until he stumbled away from the ground. He later admitted he had not believed a word of Price's accounts until Borley itself had answered him. The site attracted psychics as well. Mediums claimed to feel multiple presences: a nun who radiated sorrow, a monk cloaked in rage, and others they described as fractured voices, restless and fragmented, unable to speak clearly. One psychic, during a trance, warned her audience that the ground itself remembers. She insisted that Borley's curse was not contained to the house but to the very soil beneath it, soaked in centuries of suffering. Not all encounters were as subtle. Campers who dared to spend the night nearby reported seeing figures moving between the trees, sometimes black shapes, sometimes pale forms in flowing garments. One group of teenagers, skeptical and armed with bravado, set up tents near the site. Hours after midnight, one awoke to see a woman in a veil standing motionless only yards away, watching. He screamed, waking the others, but when they rushed outside, there was nothing. The boy never camped again. As television and film crews began producing paranormal documentaries in the 1980s and 1990s, Borley inevitably became a centerpiece. Crews brought infrared cameras, sound sensors, and night vision lenses. Time and again, their films showed unexplained shadows darting across ruined paths, or faint female figures caught for only a frame before vanishing. One broadcast captured a disembodied voice whispering during a seance held on site, though no participant had spoken. The voice, when slowed down, seemed to say, "Release me." Still, controversy shadowed every report. Skeptics continued to insist that the legacy of Harry Price tainted everything. To them, Borley had become a psychological phenomenon. People saw ghosts because they expected to see ghosts. They argued that cold winds were drafts from the open fields, that strange sounds were animals, and that blurred photographs were simply human error. Yet, the dismissals failed to stop people from returning. If Borley was only in the imagination, then the imagination itself had become haunted. Perhaps the most compelling testimonies came not from researchers or thrill seekers but from locals who lived with Borley's legacy daily. A retired farmer recounted seeing a woman in black drifting across the road at dusk, so real he pulled his cart aside to let her pass, only to watch her vanish in the middle of the lane. A postal worker delivering letters near the old site described hearing footsteps crunching on gravel behind him. Turning quickly, he found no one, yet the sound persisted until he ran. Even clergymen remained cautious. Some refused to walk the land at night, insisting that consecration had failed to lift its shadow. One vicar admitted, off the record, that he had seen the nuns standing at the garden wall in the moonlight, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "I do not preach ghosts," he whispered, "but I saw what I saw." By the turn of the 21st century, Borley Rectory existed more in story than in structure. Yet the stories were relentless. Every new generation added its own encounters: ghost hunters with gadgets, teenagers daring each other, locals who swore the nuns still walked in silence. The burned remains may have been carted away, but Borley endured as if the house had imprinted itself onto the land, its walls invisible but still present in memory and myth. And so, more than half a century after the last brick had crumbled, the question remained unresolved. Was Borley Rectory the grandest fraud in paranormal history, or the most persistent haunting England had ever known? Perhaps the answer was both, a house where belief and fear built their own foundations, where the living and the dead were forever entwined, refusing to let one another go. Even now, more than 80 years after the flames consumed Borley Rectory, the legend endures with a grip as cold as the nuns' gaze. The house itself is gone, reduced to ash and memory, but the story refuses to be buried. Writers, filmmakers, investigators, and pilgrims still make the journey to Essex, to stand on quiet ground where weeds grow thick, listening for echoes of a house that should not have mattered, but did. The narrative of Borley has never been simple. On one side, skeptics argue that it was nothing more than a stage for Harry Price, a clever opportunist who spun folklore into fame. They point to contradictions, to unreliable witnesses, to the ease with which a creaking house, suggestible minds, and flickering candlelight can conjure terrors. To them, Borley is not haunted, it is psychology. Fear creates ghosts, and Price merely sold tickets to the show. But the other side refuses to let go. The Foysters' journals still exist, filled with descriptions of bruises, scratches, and violent assaults. The testimonies of villagers, given long before Price arrived, tell of the nun gliding through the gardens. Police constables, clergy, and ordinary neighbors, people with little to gain, spoke of bells ringing, voices calling, and faces at windows long abandoned. Even after the house burned, these experiences did not end. Skeptics can dismiss a single man, but can they dismiss a century of witnesses? And then there is the question of the nun herself. Her story, whether rooted in medieval truth or Victorian imagination, became inseparable from the haunting. Generations described the same sorrowful figure, her head bowed, her steps heavy with grief. She did not rage like a poltergeist or menace like a demon, she mourned. Her presence was not a threat but a lament, a cry that outlasted time. If she was invention, she was the most persistent invention the English countryside ever produced. The ground itself carries the weight of her sorrow. Visitors today report sensations not tied to broken bricks or ruins but to the very soil beneath their feet. The silence is thick, oppressive, as though the air still holds the tension of prayers unanswered. Some swear they hear voices whispering through the hedges. Others claim a sudden, inexplicable chill races through them as they cross the property line, a line no longer marked by walls but still clear to the soul. Borley has become something more than a haunting, it has become a mirror. Those who walk there carry their beliefs with them, and the rectory reflects it back. To skeptics, it offers creaks, shadows, and psychology. To believers, it offers proof of survival beyond death. To the fearful, it offers nightmares that do not fade with dawn. Perhaps that is why Borley cannot be forgotten. It is not only about what happened within its walls, but about what those walls came to symbolize, the thin veil between the living and the dead, the desperate need for answers, the way tragedy can stain a place until it breeds sorrow. When darkness falls over the Essex countryside and the wind moves through the hedges, there are still those who refuse to pass by the old rectory grounds. They say the nun is still there, walking our eternal path. They say the bells still ring at midnight. They say Borley has not gone at all, it has only become invisible, waiting for the living to remember it. And maybe that is the most haunting truth of all, the most haunted house in England no longer exists, yet it has never truly left.